Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. It's been 1 year since the Beirut port exploded, killing over 200 people, wounding thousands, and destroying the most important mode of trade for an import-dependent country on the brink of collapse. And it's been 2 years since Lebanon's Ponzi scheme economy started crashing, sparking protests that were quickly co-opted by various political parties and turning a once relatively prosperous developing country into one of the poorest, where shortages of medicine and fuel and hyperinflation are paralyzing everyday life. The West and its media mouthpieces often blame the devastation that's befallen Lebanon on government mismanagement, on sectarianism, on bureaucratic incompetence, on internal corruption, and their favorite boogeyman, Hezbollah. But you can't speak honestly about Lebanon's problems without mentioning constant US, Saudi, and Israeli meddling, Western imperialism, the neoliberal dystopia that was imposed on Lebanon, and US sanctions. And you can't isolate Lebanon from destructive US policies in the countries surrounding it, from Syria to Iraq to Iran and Palestine. To discuss how Lebanon got to where it is, I'm joined by Jamal Ghosn, a columnist at the leftist and most widely circulated Lebanese newspaper, Akhbar. Jamal, welcome.
Hello.
So a really quick reminder for those who are listening, you can watch every episode of Rania Khalek Dispatches on the Breakthrough News YouTube channel. And for those who are watching, make sure you click the subscribe button. And you can also listen to every episode of Rania Khalek Dispatches anywhere you get podcasts. Now to the topic at hand. Jamal, before we delve in too deep, I want to start by maybe hearing from you a brief description of daily life here in Lebanon. You know, we're recording this in Beirut, the country's capital, where the state is only able to provide like 3 to 4 hours of electricity a day. And, you know, there's these massive medicine shortages. I have relatives, I'm sure you have relatives as well, that people are depending on to bring them medicine from outside because it's gotten so bad. We're all dependent on generators for electricity at this point. So just a very brief description of what life is like here on the ground from you, and then we can go into the other issues.
I mean, obviously, there are a lot of the basic services that most people take for granted anywhere else in the world have become a bit difficult to come by here. You mentioned electricity. That's a big one, a major one. But that's, if you want to like track or trace it back to the original problem, that's fuel shortages. That's what's causing the major outages or the major power cuts that have been affecting Lebanon, and that carries out to everything else. And and that's mainly because the imports of fuel have been hindered by the economic collapse and the lack of financial liquidity and basically foreign currencies that are required to purchase such an important commodity. So this is basically all due to the economic collapse, and everything else, all the shortages you mentioned, a large number of these items remain or have to be subsidized right now for people to still be able to support, to afford them. And since they can't, there's only a limited amount of dollars that that country possesses. They can only subsidize so much to prevent basically a more chaotic situation where people cannot afford basic needs such as medicine, food, and electricity and fuel and anything else that is needed for daily life in the 21st century.
I mean, it's pretty stark. You know, you and I were together a few days ago, and we were around it. It's interesting in Lebanon. Obviously, there's like a huge number of people in this country that are living under the poverty line now, but the shortages impacting the country are also impacting people with money. And we were, the other day when we were together, every conversation everybody was having at this restaurant we were at was dominated by how much electricity they're getting every day. So it really is, something that the fuel shortages. I mean, it's not just the electricity either. It's also like everything. It breaks everything down, right? Like water pumps depend on fuel to function. So the country is at risk of not being able to properly pump water for the vast majority of people who can't afford to buy, water privately. That's going to be catastrophic. And everything else that goes along with it. I mean, it's a real stark reminder, I guess, of how dependent every little daily activity we do is on fuel. I don't think most people in the world realize that until, their daily requirements for basic things, whether it's putting gasoline in your car or turning your lights on, are hindered by shortages like this. But that said, I want to get back to that, but I want to turn for a moment to the issue of the Beirut port blast, because obviously we're hitting the 1-year anniversary. That issue is in the news. So I just real quick for those, the official account, I just want to give the official story of what happened with this Beirut port blast and then get your take on it. The official story is that something like 2,754 tons of this highly explosive material, ammonium nitrate, were captured by the Lebanese from this Russian-leased cargo ship back in 2013. And then the substance sat at the port improperly stored all that time until last August when it exploded. Of course, not everybody is buying the official story. There's all kinds of theories running around. A lot of people believe it was the Israelis or the Saudis intentionally attacked or lit this fire to destroy the countries, and others have tried to pin it on Hezbollah or even the Syrian government. There's this theory going around that the Syrian government was importing it to use in its war against these various rebel groups. That story's actually received some traction in the mainstream media, though there's really, I don't think, any truth to it, because the Syrian government actually produces ammonium nitrate for agriculture itself. It wouldn't need to import it from Lebanon, but that's besides the point. But the reason I bring this up is, one theory that hasn't received attention that I've heard floated around among security circles is that, there was a certain amount intended for use by the Syrian rebel groups that was being smuggled through Lebanon, which is, of course, very plausible. There's an FBI investigation that the Lebanese government seems to agree with that found that only 552 tons of this substance actually exploded last August. So there's a question of what happened to the other 1,700 tons that arrived in 2013. I mean, all we can do is sit here and speculate, but I'm curious, what do you think? Like, what if we had to pick a theory here, what would your theory be?
I wouldn't pick any of those. I think, the FBI investigation that just came out, says that the size of the explosion is equivalent to that amount of 500 tons of ammonium nitrate. That can be attributed to many things. This shipment has been sitting there for 7 years, and it's you cannot to get the full effect or the full power, if you want, create an explosion with 2,700 tons. You need multiple. I'm not an expert, explosive expert, but you cannot. It's not easy to make them all explode at once. You need different detonators planted in strategic places to actually get the full effect. That's what I read. I really don't. But the idea that it was stored, even it was used by Syrian rebels or the Syrian government, seems a bit far-fetched, because there were lines of supplies to both sides of any kinds of weapons that they needed, that they don't need actually ammonium nitrate, which is used in agriculture and readily available anywhere. It's not that hard to get for the Syrian government, for example, or for people who are getting real weapons or from proper channels, military grade weapons. Having to resort to ammonium nitrate seems a bit far-fetched. I'm not dismissing the theory. I'm just saying that it just doesn't make sense that parties that were getting all these weapons and can get all the weapons they want through other channels, they would resort to just getting some ammonium nitrate through all this scheme. It just seems like too much work when they can actually get bombs shipped to them. And they were getting bombs shipped to them, whether the government or the opposition forces. So that's why it's. I mean, it's possible. I think it's more. I mean, the main issue here, the only thing we know for sure, is that there was huge amounts of negligence by the Lebanese authorities over these 7 years, that they've continuously known that there was this amount of dangerous material stored in poor conditions at the port. It was a time bomb. It was just a matter of time that this was going to happen, and nobody did anything. So this is what we know. I mean, it's 7 years. You can't hide something for someone for 7 years. There's just utter negligence that cannot there's no other way to of explaining what happened there. It's criminal negligence, and that's what we know for sure. If you want to go into the details of how and why and how they get there, that's up to the investigators and to figure it out. But no matter what the conclusion is, no matter who brought them, no matter why, they sat there for 7 years, and multiple authorities in the Lebanese government knew about it, and there's correspondence between different branches and different institutions saying that these are dangerous, and they're sitting there, and nobody did anything. So that's what we know. So
there's also the issue, right, of like all the theories I just explained are very politicized theories. Their accusations being lobbed by people to kind of blame their political opponents or people they don't like politically on or for what happened. That said, recently there were several names of security officers who came up for questioning in the investigation into the port explosion. Do you think this is based on evidence, or is this also politicized?
I mean, just as I said right now, there was negligence by many institutions, security-wise, or the ministries in charge of the port and the port authority. They should all be questioned. They're all suspects in some form of negligence. That's beyond question. Now, what they're saying is politicized about the latest round is that it targeted officials that are considered to be of one team and omitted the ones who are of the opposing team. And here I'm talking about, basically, if I want to go back to the 2005 namings of the political divide in Lebanon, there was a March 8 forces and March 14 forces. They seem to have named only those who are close to March 8 forces and not March 14th, and this is what prompted, even though, I mean, there were multiple people who have served in various positions that had knowledge and should be also questioned and charged, frankly, because there is a massive crime that occurred, and somebody has to be responsible. It's not just that wasn't just an accident. This was criminal negligence. Anyway, so this is where the charges of politicization come from. The judge who's carrying out the investigation is actually saying that this is only the beginning, that there are other names, and actually he's not speaking. They are saying, or they are leaking on his behalf, because he has not, according to Lebanese law, he also cannot address the issue publicly. And this is a major issue that opens the door for a lot of speculation, a lot of leaks and whatnot. And this is since we don't have an official statement from the people carrying out the investigation. So now you have all the different stories that come out are either partial or selective in what they reveal, because they can be politicized and will be politicized in this very tense and time in the country. So that's normal. But again, it's been 1 year, and there doesn't seem to be a serious effort to hold anyone accountable. And I think there's a very good chance that no one will be held accountable. I mean, we're witnessing the complete failure of the state institutions, and that opens the door towards impunity that could very well happen in this case.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I was funny to see the Human Rights Watch had issued this report on the port explosion, as if it was a human rights issue, as opposed to like criminal light negligence by a state. And I just thought that was interesting, because you would never see Human Rights Watch issue a report on, say, the Miami building collapse, which was also a failure of this, local state governance, in my opinion. That killed some 200 people. So there has been an effort also internationally to politicize it. And just to be clear for those who are watching and listening, when you refer to March 8th versus March 14, political divide, you're talking about March 8th being basically the coalition which Hezbollah is in, as well as the Free Patriotic Movement, ML, all of these groups. And then on the other side, the March 14 side, is the Future Party, is the parties close to the US and Saudi Arabia, which is the Future Party, as well as Lebanese forces and all their affiliates.
And the Lebanese and the US ambassador and the French ambassador. And
actually, that is true.
The German ambassador is also joining in. He seems to be wanting to have some fun also.
Really? I mean, no, it's actually true.
I think this is something that also, for your audience, that needs to be said. I don't think there's any country in the world where basically the diplomats of these major powers feel they can just say and get involved in every little detail of local governance, and they give their opinion on what should be done and what shouldn't be done, and they're now openly getting involved. We have parliamentary elections next year, and they're basically running the campaigns of the candidates they want to reach parliament. And this is, I don't think there's any country where it's so blatant as it is in Lebanon. I mean, I'm pretty sure if the Lebanese ambassador in Washington went to meet with the head of, I don't know, the Green Party.
God!
Like this, they would be immediately kicked out. Like this is, they'll be the persona non grata and kicked out. This is not something.
No, I mean, that, I think people. What you're talking about is, if you go look at WikiLeaks cables throughout the years, you can literally see that the Lebanese embassy, or I'm sorry, the U.S. embassy, was meeting with on a regular basis the political parties that you're referring to on the March 14 side, not only meeting with them, connecting them to consultants. And some consultants came directly from the National Democratic Institute, the NDI, which is a part of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the regime change arm of the US government that basically does overtly today what the CIA used to do covertly in other countries.
What was revealed in WikiLeaks was supposed to be a secret. It was done behind closed doors. What the U.S. ambassador today is doing, she's doing it openly. She has basically, they have on the primetime news, there's a segment dedicated for U.S. embassy propaganda. It's openly, like there's every night on LBC and MTV, there's a few minutes that are paid advertisement by the U.S. embassy. That's other than actual paid advertisements that are crazy. Making it on air during prime time. And see that what was happening behind closed doors that was revealed through the cables that were published through WikiLeaks is now happening in the open. And they're meeting openly with activists and whatnot. When David Schenker came, they would, and before he was relieved of his duties and as Undersecretary of State, he openly held meetings with activists in Lebanon, and they were proudly displaying them. That's the difference between what's happening now and what happened then. It seems like the U.S. also have lost faith in its tools here. that they want to do things with their own hands, and this is what we're witnessing right now in Lebanon. We're seeing that mainly the U.S. also now they seem to have delegated some tasks to the French, but they seem to be fed up with the people who were basically serving their interests throughout these years. The March 14th forces have basically collapsed, and they want to recreate them, but there's no one like that can deliver as they used to deliver before, and they've invested all this money in this alternative movement, but none of them seem to be able to carry the load or deliver what's expected of them politically. So they're taking things into their own hands, and it's kind of comical if it wasn't for everything. I mean, that people are suffering here, but it's watching the U.S. ambassador running campaigns for municipality elections in some small town in North Lebanon is very
wait. What
funny.
specifically are you referring to? What specific instance are you referring to?
I
Give
mean,
an example.
no, if you watch all the videos that Dorothy Shea, the U.S. ambassador here, releases on a weekly basis, some of them are promotions of how much money they spent in this or that small municipality in this town, and they're trying to prop up certain forces that they support in little tiny small towns here and there in Lebanon. And they're actually, the ambassador herself is going there and doing the promotion. Like, they can't even trust the locals to deliver the message. That they have to do it themselves. It's gonna be. I mean, it's good to see them going door to door and campaigning for candidates. I hate to break it to them. It's not going to work, but
it's not going to work.
Let's wait till they discover that for themselves.
Well, so, okay, I want to talk a little bit, moving on from that, now that you kind of laid the groundwork a little bit between in the political divide in Lebanon, where you have these two sides, one of them, which is, the Hezbollah affiliated side, the March 8th side. If you still want to even use these two divides, the other is the pro-U.S. or U.S. tool March 14 side that the U.S. has kind of lost faith in, as you said, because they weren't able to deliver after just, millions and millions of dollars in consultancies poured into them to try to help them deliver billions. I'm curious.
It's not. I mean, the system that was in place. Now we're talking about an economic collapse and a bankruptcy, but the system has gone bankrupt many times before, and they have floated it with 8 conferences, the ones that are the Paris 1, Paris 2, Paris 3, 8 conferences. These were not to aid Lebanon. These were to bail out the political and economical establishment that was serving U.S. interests, and since the end of the Cold War, this has gone bankrupt before multiple times, and it was bailed out. But back then, the cost of bailing out this political class in order to counterbalance the forces that are against U.S. hegemony in the region was minor compared to what it is today. They were able to deliver more. I mean, we're talking in the days that they had Rafiq Hariri leading that front. They were able to have a very significant power to counter the power of Hezbollah, for example, that's seen as or that is against the U.S. interests or working against U.S. interference here, and mainly because of its support for the Israeli occupation of Palestine, which is still the biggest issue that needs to be dealt with in the region, because without ending this settler colonial project, that's been a burden here in the country for in the region for 70, how many years now has it been? Since 48. And
70 years.
the region will never prosper. So this
Yeah.
is something that this is the ultimate fight. Everything else is just a repercussion of this occupation and this colonial project through so this is the main issue here. I mean, we cannot overlook that. Any discussion about the region, and specifically here, Lebanon, is we're bordering Palestine, has to take that into account. So, if we, so go ahead.
Well, what I was going to ask is with all that in mind, when we talk about this economic collapse that's taking place right now, it's a part of also the political crisis that's taking place in Lebanon is all tied up with the economic collapse. The World Bank has called it the worst economic collapse since the 1800s. The currency has devalued by 90%. I mean, we've all heard this repeated over and over in different media accounts. But in very simple terms, can you explain to people what happened? Why did Lebanon's economy almost overnight, it feels like, go from being admired as some sort of miracle that was repeatedly bailed out, as you mentioned? How did it go from that to being in utter ruin like it is today? And who is responsible for that?
Well, that didn't happen overnight. You don't go broke overnight. What happened is that it was built to go broke. This system, neoliberal system that was put in place where you drown the country in debt and then basically buy it for cheap, is a model that was applied in many countries in the global south, especially after the end of the Cold War, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of the unipolar world controlled by the US. So this is not unique to Lebanon. What happened in unique is it was basically even more extreme in the amount of in how the bankers and their political networks have abused the system to be. I mean, it's kind of also idiotic on their part because when you own basically everything in the country, you need to at least keep a functioning economy, because any economic growth is directly going to benefit you because you control most of the country. But they're thankfully they're idiots, and they've what they did, they were just running a Ponzi scheme. You call it a Ponzi scheme. It is a Ponzi scheme. They were in order to keep the financial sector running, they were offering interest rates that cannot be sustained, and that's why they were bailed out multiple times before. And then when the fourth bailout was due, nobody was willing to foot the bill. The economic and political elites that were running this system had no reason to believe that they will let them fail, but nobody was willing to pump in billions of dollars to float them and let them have the benefit that they've enjoyed for the past 3 decades, mainly because they can't deliver on the political front anymore. I mentioned this before, like back then when they were throwing the hundreds of millions of dollars into to bail them out, they actually were a political force that provided some sort of balance in the country against Hezbollah. Now the money that's going to go to all of these people cannot deliver this counterbalance, no matter how much money they throw at them. So they're just not going to bail them out again. So this is what happened. So this system was meant to fail. It was meant to be bankrupt. There was strong opposition to it by leftist forces. The initial or the beginning of this economic strategy of borrowing to basically float the banking system. It was strongly opposed in the 90s when Rafik Hariri imposed it on the country. But it still went through, and many of the critics back then said that this is where we're going to get. And and I mean, it was obvious that you're building a Ponzi scheme, and it was never going to be sustainable. So this is what happened. So with the collapse, again, there is still, I mean, imagine that we're in a country, I said that this is, it happened in many other instances in the global south, and it will continue to happen. But what makes Lebanon more extreme is that here we have right now the solution proposed by the World Bank and the IMF are actually they are progressive compared to what the government was doing. Like, this is how extreme the system was here. I mean, with all impartiality, if you look at what the World Bank and the IMF are proposing, they are definitely to the left of what Rafik Hariri and his allies had in place in the country for the past 30 years.
You know, and I think it's good that you mentioned Rafik Hariri, because the way, it's always amazing to me to see how the way that this is portrayed in the mainstream press in the US and in other Western countries is that somehow this is the fault of everyone in the political class equally. Or there's even attempts, of course, to somehow pit the blame by more extreme neocon elements to pin the blame on Hezbollah. And what's so ironic about that is that Rafik Hariri, Riad Salameh, the head of the central bank, these are America's allies who architected the system with the blessing of the international community and the West. So how do you respond to that? How do you respond to attempts to blame Hezbollah for this economic collapse?
I mean, of course, if they weren't fighting Hezbollah, if they didn't have the US did not have, if they had a country that was just behaving the way they like it, they wouldn't impose these sanctions and threats. And I mean, again, here is where the siege of the economy takes multiple forms. And so, of course, yeah, Hezbollah is the reason they want, because it is resisting occupation and US hegemony. But you can't expect people to just lie down and give up and not fight back. So you want to blame people for standing up for their rights and wanting to liberate their land, and then yes, sure, blame them. But this is going to happen. Like, that is they're not going to stop. So this is but on the other hand, like, if and also I don't want to put all the blame on Rafik Hariri. There was the Taif troika, or this was an agreement that ended the civil war in Lebanon, brought a troika of into power that includes Nabih Berri, and well, it's supposed to also be the president of the republic, but the president of the republic, since Taif has always been weakened after the war. So the third member of this troika would be Walid Jumblat. These are basically, after Hariri's death and assassination in 2005, Nabih Berri and Walid Jumblat have out-Hariri'd Hariri, so they are not they cannot escape the blame in terms of being true or remaining true to the economic system that was put in place.
And these are of course the Civil War era warlords who, after the war, took off their uniforms and put on suits and became the country's oligarchs.
I mean, yes, in partnership with the old oligarchs that never went away, which are the banking families and the monopolists that control many of the. I mean, we talked earlier about fuel, and there is a fuel cartel that's been in place since the establishment of this country. You said there are also shortages of medicines. Last week in Akhbar, there was a story that basically mapped out the medicine cartel in Lebanon, and it can be traced back to mid 19th century. Like, this is how entrenched this oligarchy is in Lebanon, and they have monopolies over all the main components of the economy, and that's why it's hard to basically remove or it's a multi-pronged front that you have to fight in order to liberate the country from not only foreign occupation, but the monopoly of the oligarchs.
It's a like capitalist libertarian paradise in Lebanon in so many ways, run by a bunch of different mafias. I'm curious, on the political front, what is your take on why, we've watched last year the government resigned after the port explosion, and they've been in a caretaker capacity since, which has prevents the government and ties their hands in many ways from making any major decisions with regard to the economic collapse. So the country's been waiting and waiting for a new government to be formed, and Saad Hariri, the head of the Future Party, spent the last 8 or 9 months wasting everyone's time, I guess kind of obstructing government formation. And now we have, this new attempt with Mikati to be in charge of, or to be the next prime minister, to be in charge of forming a government. Do you think this is the end of the Hariri family's political relevance? Or is that too optimistic on my part?
I mean, the Hariri's political influence is not just by being head of government. I mean, the entire bureaucracy and the entire government is staffed by people belonging to the future movement, the Amal movement. It's headed by Barry, the Jamal, the head of the. I can't even say the name of his party seriously, because he's.
So say it so everyone. Say it so everyone can laugh. Say it so everyone can laugh.
So yeah, we have a feudal lord who heads the Progressive Socialist Party. And
which is neither socialist or progressive.
It's one of the most reactionary and I mean, it's anyway, let's not waste too much time on him.
On Walid Jumblat.
But yeah, I mean, it can't be taken seriously. But he's a darling of the West and has been for forever, due to his progressive and socialist policies, of course. He's proud that Joe Biden visited him here in his house back when he was a senator, and so yeah. Anyway, so we have I forgot what we were talking about.
We're talking about the Hariri family. I was saying, do you think this is the end of his
political
political
relevance?
that
they were well entrenched in all of the state institutions, so this is not something that you just can go away that easily. So yeah, no, it's not the end. It's I think I mean it's nearing its end. It's all it's been a free fall since basically since Saad Hariri took over, because he's not exactly the most competent person on earth, and we have a power.
It'll come back. It'll come back. It'll come back. This is perfect. This is perfect. It's to really give everybody an understanding of what it's like to be in Lebanon. Although I'm lucky because it's about to come back on, but in most places it won't. You just have to wait until it comes back again from the state. So now we're on generator. We can continue.
Yes. So yeah, as I was saying, that it's not something that you can adjust by changing the head of state. Not that Miati, the person who's appointed or nominated to form the new government right now, is much. I mean, he's also a billionaire, a corrupt billionaire that believes in the same economic policy that he was a minister under Hariri for many years, and he was prime minister before, and he's on an economic front, he's no different than Hariri. So this is a continuation of Harirism, and it's not the end yet.
So I want to ask you about the issue of sanctions because this often gets left out of the conversation. I mean, Lebanon is not under the same kinds of sanctions as, say, Iran is or Syria is. However, the EU has released this sanctions framework threatening to sanction Lebanese political elites for corruption, though they don't really lay out what that means exactly. So basically, just, I guess that could apply to any officials that aren't doing what they want. That said, how is Lebanon impacted by this current sanctions regime being imposed on the region, both against people in Lebanon, but as well as on neighbors like Syria and Iran? Because, there's the Caesar Act on Syria, which essentially prevents Lebanon from being able to purchase things from Syria, and that includes power. So Lebanon used to get some power from Syria. Now it can't. Otherwise, it will be subject to secondary sanctions if it just does basic business with its neighbor. So I guess, can you elaborate on that a bit? How do sanctions in the Middle East that maybe aren't necessarily attacking Lebanon specifically, how do they impact Lebanon?
I mean, first of all, there are political parties and individuals who are sanctioned by the US government. Including the head of the Free Patriotic Movement, which is the party with the largest bloc in parliament in this current parliament. So, and other members of other parties. That it's not just the actual sanctions; it's the threat of sanctions that prevents people from doing business with certain parties. You mentioned Syria, for example. Lebanon, for those who don't know, is basically has the sea on one side, the Mediterranean Sea, has occupied Palestine in the south, so there's no trade there. And from the north and the east, there's Syria. So any natural trade routes will have to go through Syria. And now, with all the sanctions on Syria, that directly affects Lebanon, and it scares business people who do not want to be looked at or do not want to be on US sanctions list from doing any kind of business with basically anywhere along the land border of Lebanon. So that's a form of siege. Again, the sanctions that were levied on some politicians also are basically a stick that they want to scare. What's his name? David Hale was used to love the term the carrots and the sticks, and that he uses a lot of carrots and sticks in the region. Well, that's something that they want to scare people from. From getting too close or getting allied, for example, with Hezbollah, which is one of the biggest and most important political parties in the country, and resistance movements in the region. So that's just basically scares people from doing. So this is how it works. It doesn't have to be direct sanctions. You mentioned the framework by the EU that they issued. They actually there seemed to be some opposition within Europe. That's why they came out with a watered down version of the sanctions, or just a framework for sanctions. But that's also a threat, like behave or else. And this is kind of form this sanctions take. On other fronts, for example, there are threats. I mentioned how we had monopolies that controlled many of the vital economic sectors in Lebanon, and there are basically they want to maintain that. You are not allowed to get fuel from certain sources, Iran,
such as Iran.
So actually, there was, after there was a threat to go to Iran for oil, basically they allowed them to get from Iraq. So this was like a kind of, okay, fine, you can do that, but not that.
For those who are watching, Jamal, you're referring to Iran literally offered to sell Lebanon oil in local currency, which is essentially like giving it to Lebanon for free. And the pro-American side of the political class was like, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And then suddenly we had this deal with Iraq for free oil for Lebanon, basically, is what just to give people some background to what you're referring to.
Yes, so that's one of the things that how the sanctions and the siege put into practice. So this is it's not traditional, direct siege where they say like happened with Iraq during the Saddam era, or what's happening with Venezuela, or what's happening with Cuba, but it comes in different forms, and this is how it's practiced here.
Yeah, and there was this Washington Post article recently by some of our favorite writers, and it was about the electricity shortages in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, which are all experiencing these, massive, almost, all day long electricity cuts. And the title was "Power Outages Cripple Parts of the Middle East." And the piece was quite lengthy. It blamed the problem almost exclusively on local corruption and, weak infrastructure and poor planning. And there wasn't a word about the many wars on these countries that have actually intentionally targeted a power infrastructure, whether it's Israel and Lebanon, or the US and Iraq, or in Syria more recently. There wasn't a word about the issue of sanctions.
Let's not get it wrong. There is the local corruption.
Right. No, I'm not denying that.
Mismanagement locally. But it's also very important to point out that the corrupt leaders who have mismanaged these countries were supported and floated by basically the West. So it's not like that they
with a system, in the case of at least Lebanon and Iraq, especially with Iraq, with systems that were literally built by the West and are reflections of Western neoliberal systems. And I'm not denying that issue exists of local corruption, and you're right to point out who are the corrupt ones here. But my point is to say, like, you can't. It's just amazing to write like a 1,500 word piece about power cuts in these countries without mentioning the sanctions. Because Lebanon's power infrastructure has always sucked. Iraq's power infrastructure has always sucked. However,
it was destroyed by the war.
After it was destroyed by the war, and then even more recently, like, it's always sucked. But you cannot tell me that Lebanon, for example, 2 years ago had the same crappy power infrastructure that it has now. Right? Very weak and messed up with power cuts, but the power cuts were not 20 hours a day. The power cuts right now are not a result of weak power infrastructure primarily. They're a result of the fuel shortages you talked about. So it's just like, to talk about these things without mentioning like the big, anaconda in the room that's strangling every country is just amazing to me. And then this issue of corruption that's being invoked constantly, which again is an issue, like you mentioned. But do you feel like lately it's become this kind of term that's invoked by the West to, like, in almost like a regime change kind of way? Like, it's only invoked as an issue against countries that America doesn't like. So corruption's only an issue in Iran. Corruption's only an issue with Syria. Corruption's only an issue in Lebanon because of Hezbollah.
No. I think it's corruption is very by design. It's not necessarily a regime change tactic. It's a regime renewal tactic, and to renew. The Lebanese system, the Lebanese government that was bailed out by the West, is seen as a Western ally still to today. It has factions, resistance factions in it that are against this Western influence and basically neo-colonialism. Let's call it what it is. And then people are fighting against that. But what they want, for example, when they say there's corruption in Lebanon, they want to replace the already expired servants that they had, that were very loyal and they did their job over the years, but they cannot continue to deliver. So they want to replace that with a cleaner version that's more palatable to the people. So this is what's happening right now in Lebanon. And when you say corruption, that means you don't want to change the economic system. You don't want to change anything. You just want to replace a corrupt official with a non-corrupt official who will continue along the same line. So this depoliticization of anyway, that word of the narrative of the is intentional because they don't want them to talk politics. They don't want people to say we're opposed to this neoliberal system. We want alternatives. We want alternative economic policies. So that's why they simplify it and they just talk about corruption, because that's on purpose. This is like the entire NGO narrative that's been put in place about good governance and whatnot, and where that's all over the world, where they have all these organizations spreading democracy. They're spreading and all these values. They stay away from any real change to the system of governance, which is
that's a good point.
The neoliberal economic system. That's if you don't talk about it, you don't change it. You just talk about you divert and talk about different things. So you talk about.
I'm curious if you think the issue of, like, that's a good point you just made. The issue of sectarianism, which is, of course, I mean, it's baked into the structure of Lebanon, like you mentioned earlier, with the Taif Accords and stuff, where the president has to be, a Christian Maronite, and the prime minister has to be Sunni, the speaker of the house has to be Shia. And that's replicated throughout every institution in Lebanon, where you have to have this, like, equal distribution among the different sects in a way that really just reinforces clientelism and helps reinforce the system in so many ways. But with what you just described, with the sort of NGOs and their focus on everything except the foundation of the system structure, like the neoliberal foundation, another thing that they hyper focus on is sectarianism. Like, it's like, and that is a problem, but it's like, if you removed sectarianism from the Lebanese political structure, it would still remain corrupt. Like, that's not the primary, at least in my opinion, primary problem. And I don't know if you would agree with that, but it just strikes me as something that is like one of those things that people can focus on. The other issue is like secularism. And I think you see this in a lot of countries, not just Lebanon, this hyper focus among elite classes on secular versus religious, and it kind of ends up flattening out any issues of class or neoliberalism. Would you agree with that?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a diversion to basically not have a conversation about the core problem that we have. This is, I mean, it's not unique to Lebanon, but in Lebanon you have that sectarianism battle cry that I mean, it's easy. I mean, because it exists also. Cannot deny that. But also, I mean, yes, if you have a secular, less corrupt system in place that's that's neoliberal, we're still going to have the same inequality with problems. We're still going to have the same issues with same monopolies, the same oligarchy. So yeah, when we don't talk about that, and just divert the attention, then yes, it doesn't matter who wins in the end, they're still going to be serving the same interests.
And so that brings me to another question I wanted to ask you about, and that's the issue of the left in Lebanon. We've seen attempts to pursue. Yeah, the right. That's what I want to ask. No left in Lebanon. So we've seen attempts to pursue left projects, and this is a generous analysis here. We've seen attempts to pursue left projects by small parties, right? In Lebanon. Let me finish, and then you can trash it. We've seen attempts to pursue some small left projects by small parties in Lebanon, and we've seen the collapse into liberalism and irrelevance of parties such as the Communist Party. I'm going to get in trouble for saying that, but I said it. So the reason I mention this is, why? Why has the left so, I wouldn't say it's unique, because the left has failed in the whole world. It's not just here. But why has the left failed in Lebanon, in a country with so much inequality, such a disconnected elite class. It just seems like there's so many people in this country that, are for the taking. And if leftists were to be able to organize and get a message out. So why hasn't that happened? Where is the left in Lebanon? Why doesn't it exist, as you say?
Well, here we have to go back quite a while. I mean, the leftist parties, like you mentioned, the Lebanese Communist Party, which is very, very small and made up of middle class elites, which is and that's the core of the problem, that they're so disconnected from the people that it's become in the interests of many of its young members. Their interests are middle class interests, and this class struggle is it's not a priority, and this is it's problematic when you're called the Lebanese Communist Party. But other leftist movements, the main issue is that during the Cold War, basically, there was an opportunity. It was actually profitable to be a leftist because there was a Soviet investment in leftist movements. So a lot of these of the middle class elites, it was actually profitable for them to be in the leftist movements, and this ended in 1990. So we saw a lot of them just migrate naturally to right-wing neoliberal platforms. The future movements brain power came mainly from former leftists. So that's just because their own interest lied elsewhere. So there hasn't been an organic grassroots leftist movement organize or rise in Lebanon, and this is the main issue. On the grassroots level, we haven't seen any of that. I mean, there are other factors, also the economic makeup and sectarianism are issues that have helped fragment any possibility of a wide-ranging leftist movement. But mainly it's because most of the attempts of organizing for the left were top to bottom approaches, and these the top always tend to fail.
That's a really good.
So this is I mean, if we can go into much more details, but this is
I guess
right now when with a collapse of basically the bankruptcy of the system and the banking establishment, you would think is a prime opportunity for leftist narrative to emerge and to have some gain some momentum in this country. But in light of what's happening, you have seen traditional leftist parties adopt more depoliticized speech and try to ride the NGO wave rather than become more radical in their speech, which is this historic moment provides an opportunity for a more radical narrative because people want change. People the system failed them, and they are looking for alternatives. And it's kind of disappointing that there hasn't been a radical narrative emerge in the light of what's happening.
Yeah, I know you mentioned NGOs. It's kind of like the NGOization. I remember being in Tripoli during those protests in 2019 that erupted in October. that were initially quite widespread in terms of their sect and class makeup, but were quickly politicized by, Lebanese forces and the Future Party and the Progressive Socialist Party that is neither progressive nor socialist, these pro-US parties on the March 14 side of things. But I do remember being in Tripoli, which is the most impoverished city in Lebanon. And there was protests that day, as there were every day, that a lot of NGOs had kind of turned into a concert, this sort of like depoliticized concert. And I saw the Lebanese Communist Party had a contingent there. And there was people just sitting around, like unemployed people sitting around waiting to be organized. And they were saying they want to be organized. They like want a leader. And I looked over to what the Lebanese Communist Party was doing, and they were holding this like, this is just an anecdote. I don't know if this is what they always do. So like, I don't mean to just single them out. This is just, I remember having this thought when I saw it, is they were holding this event on how to open up public spaces. I'm just sitting here thinking that just seems really kind of disconnected from the material concerns of the people who are at this protest, who are all like talking about they can't afford medical care. Like, I don't think the first thing on their minds is, how can we open up more public spaces? Which is a very NGO thing to talk about. Not a bad thing, but just very like far away from these material concerns of people who, can't afford to keep a roof over their head or feed their 5 children, right? So anyways, that's just an anecdotal, aside to, do you think that this kind of NGOization, this lack of radicalism, is why the 2019 protests failed to materialize into anything substantial? And furthermore, do you think that Hezbollah actually has a more, I wouldn't say leftist, but they have like a more of an ideology in so many ways than the left does, like a more clear ideology than the left in Lebanon or maybe in the Middle East does. I don't know if you'd agree with that or disagree, but I'd like to hear your opinion.
Well, I mean, obviously the lack of the depoliticization of the October 2019 protests and turning it into basically carnival where you can just have people asking for change without any or fight just corrupt. We mentioned the fight against corruption and the need for a different class of people, but not different policies was done intentionally, of course. And yes, this was an opportunity. I mean, again, there is. I mean, it hasn't ended. The crisis is only beginning. It might get worse. It will get worse. So the idea is that there is still an opportunity, and there are people who want change, and there is room for other players, for new players, to come into the political scene in Lebanon and try to show people that there are alternatives. So this opportunity is there, and I mean, you asked me about Hezbollah in the region. They have their ideology. On the economy, they don't seem to be very concerned with changing they've armed themselves with alternatives to combat sanctions and to maintain their ability to fight their war against Israeli occupation of Palestine and the U.S. Control of the region, but without a clear ideology on economic ideology. And this they seem to, not care. I mean, they haven't given it. It's not a priority to them. So right. That's I mean, what we can do or what can be done is that they have proven that they can, if they'll find they've been pragmatic with their alliances, and they we can see that in the way they've had their alliance with FPM, which and their alliance with Amal. And what happened, actually, I'll take you back to October 17th, 2019, is that for the first few days, a lot of people who came down to protest, they basically listened to or respect what Hezbollah has done in terms of resistance, that they listen to what they have to say. So Hezbollah, for the first few days, they were monitoring the movement, and didn't take a strong stance against or didn't allowed some of its supporters to go down. And then they called on their supporters to come out of the streets.
Right.
And that actually diminished the numbers quite a bit when they did that. And this was seen as an act that protected the current establishment. What really happened is that they basically assessed the size of the opposition and who's in it and what it could mean. And had they seen that there was a critical mass that was, let's say, that would force them to break some of their alliances and maybe align with other groups, they probably would have done that. But because it wasn't as big as pushing as to push them to break existing alliances, which they need to maintain some stability in an ongoing war. They didn't do that. So this is what happened then. And I would think if there was a significant, this is all hypothetical because there isn't a significant
but
leftist
if there was,
movement, that if there was, they are willing to align themselves and maybe to adopt certain different economic policies, but they're just not going to fight the leftists fight for them, basically. And this is what some people expect them to do, and no, they're not a leftist movement, so they're not gonna do that.
That's a good point. I want to turn for a minute to, you mentioned the issue of war. As Lebanon continues to collapse, do you think there's a risk of a civil war?
No.
That's an easy no. I don't either, but everyone, it's a funny thing, especially in the summertime. People in Lebanon, because there's always wars.
We've had incidents in the last couple of days where they could push towards retaliatory killings and whatnot, and vendettas that might quickly erupt into violence. We've had all these. You mentioned all the fuel shortages. We've had incidents and fights that have happened at gas lines, and these can always, deteriorate into much worse forms of violence. But a civil war require who's going to fight the civil war? The money the money and the weapons can be easily pumped into.
Yeah, but it requires, I guess, it requires outside investment, and nobody from outside seems to want to invest.
It requires fighters. It requires fighters, and if we're anybody that's gonna come launch a war against. Mainly, it would be against Hezbollah to serve again the interests of the enemies of Hezbollah. There were people who want Lebanon to be back an obedient Western colony. That's not it would be suicide on any party that does that. There is no possibility of civil war. The only war that is going to happen is the war for the liberation of Palestine. It's ongoing. We have certain battles that happen here and there, but there will be a bigger war at some point. And that's the only war that is going to happen in the region, and or this part of the region, because there are ongoing wars all over the region.
Right. Yeah, I remember during the war on Gaza, there was these liberal types who were like, well, Hezbollah's not doing anything to help. But these are the same people who would be so angry if Hezbollah got involved, because they'd be like, Hezbollah dragged us into a war with Israel. So anyways, I thought that was funny. I just wanted to make
Yeah,
fun
I
of
mean,
them for a
it was
second.
Hamas themselves, the top officials in Hamas said that Hezbollah was involved. So it's not,
Yeah,
involved
exactly.
doesn't mean firing rockets from Lebanon. It means
Exactly.
there are, much of the
Intelligence,
technology and
strategic.
the technology,
Yeah.
no, and the technology and the development of the weapons
Mhm.
and the delivery of weapons to Gaza, so the Palestinians can stand a
Actually
fighting
fight.
chance against the Israeli occupation comes from Hezbollah and their allies. So this is not a secret. This is known. So yeah, all these. I mean, it doesn't matter what
It
like you
doesn't
said, the
matter.
liberals will say what the liberals will liberal.
Yeah, well, liberal. But you mentioned, you alluded to this, but you were talking about what happened a few days ago. Basically, a few nights ago, there were these clashes between Sunni tribes and Shias in the south of Beirut and Khaldi. Can you explain what happened and why this seems to occur every year? You don't need to go too in depth, but it is happening right now. It's in the news. So
I mean, this is also an exaggeration. There weren't clashes between tribes, and there was an well, there was a killing, a homicide, and
pretty
then there
crazy,
was
actually.
snipers that
Theatrical.
shot at the funeral of the person who was killed the day before. So I mean, this the people who, I mean, let's see. Let's wait for the investigation. But obviously,
Yeah.
this was an attempt to stir up some trouble, maybe cause a reaction from Hezbollah that might lead into an escalation of violence. But this is not going to happen. So they're just going to bite the bullet and just work on the bigger picture, which is try to get this country out of the mess it's in.
Yeah. And speaking of that, I briefly want to touch on the issue of resilience. And not in like a cartoonish way, because people are always like, the Lebanese are so resilient. I think humans in general are pretty resilient. And of course, Lebanese people, there is a certain resiliency, I guess, from having a 15-year-long civil war. But how are Lebanese communities adapting to the crisis and pursuing self-reliance? And who are the most successful actors in this regard?
Okay, we have to mention that here that the economic collapse does not affect all people equally. Some people have suffered from the economic inequality long before the collapse, and for them, the change is not. I mean, they've already lived. They were living an impoverished life,
Right.
so these people have already had their support systems and long before the collapse. What's new in this collapse is that it's affecting people who normally could bury their hands in the sand and ignore the problems that the marginalized areas of the country had suffered for many, many years. I mean,
Mhm.
you have now migration affecting the elites, while anybody who knows anybody around the world will knows that they have Lebanese communities that have been living there for some go back over a century and multiple generations back. That because these people come from regions in Lebanon which were always marginalized and where the economy was never prioritized, and they had to leave. So what's happening now is it's affecting the center and it's affecting the elite, and these are the ones that didn't feel it before, and so these are louder. These have more
Yeah.
access to media. These are the ones that can speak English and communicate with the West. So this is why I mean they are feeling it now more, but it's very important, and they are the ones that are trying to adapt to a new situation. But that does not mean that the resilience of the people is not has not been tested and practiced for many generations in parts of the country. So this is so yes. I mean, obviously there's stuff, but when you talk power cuts, this is not new to people of Akhbar or people of Hezbollah, that they've always had over 12-hour power cuts. So if you've had 12-hour power cuts and now it's 20, it's you'll adjust. But here in Beirut, where you had you didn't feel the power cuts because you almost had 24-hour electricity, and now you have 20-hour cuts, and yeah, that's a major adjustment. So again, yeah, this is people who could afford traveling multiple times a year and now cannot. These were always a minority in of the population. So now, but those are the ones that are the loudest and have the ability to express themselves more. So this is why I mean, obviously it is huge economic collapse. I'm just saying that it has affected those who were benefiting from the economy more than those who were always marginalized by the economy.
Somebody who was able to afford very cheap maids from like Ethiopia or something 2 years ago, and now, you know, has to do their own laundry. I'm not minimizing. That's not the worst thing happening, but like things like that, like there's a certain class of people that are being affected by this economic collapse that isn't usually typical of economic collapses, which is why this one's so big. It's middle class and upper middle class people are no longer middle and upper middle class. And that's actually very bad for a country in general when you're what was already a small middle class is being completely just like demolished, because you can't have a successful country without a middle class. It just doesn't work, or a working class for that matter. And so the issue of self-reliance, though, you know, I was in my family's village a few days ago. And one thing I did notice, which is also interesting about this collapse, is that it seems to be having a bigger impact on cities than it does on more like suburban and rural areas. I'm not generalizing for the whole country, but just from what I saw. And it goes to what you were mentioning. These people who live in, who live outside of the cities in the periphery are used to the longer power cuts. They're used to kind of like dealing with all these inconveniences that come with the infrastructure weakness of Lebanon and the structural inequalities that exist here. And they have these mechanisms to deal with it. Whereas in Beirut, there isn't. You know, people don't have the mechanisms to deal with it. They're not used to it. So what I saw is like people are, it's like they're already growing their own food in the mountains. They have the space to, they have the land to. They're like, they've already got their own chickens, right? So like they don't have an egg shortage. They don't have to pay rent because a lot of their homes are generational homes that, you know, their grandparents built. And, you know, their families and extended families don't have to pay rent. So that's not an expense they have to deal with like people in Beirut do. And moreover, you know, one thing that's interesting about Lebanon too is the reliance on remittances and people outside. You know, every single relative of mine that's visiting this summer has been like a pharmacy. They're bringing, I mean, I think so much of the country is actually relying on their blood pressure medications to come from outside. So anyways, that's just kind of a commentary. I think it's interesting. And then you had mentioned, I don't know if you want to talk about it a little bit, but you had mentioned you had been in Zahli recently, which is it's like an island in Lebanon. Can you talk a little bit about like the situation there and why it's different than the rest of the country?
Well, first I want to touch on something you mentioned. You mentioned remittances, which were always a big part of the Lebanese economy. What's happening right now is also that's become cheap, or cheaper basically to maintain relatives if you live outside. If you're sending dollars, they can go a longer way than they used to. So this is something that, the remittances, and it's also, they used to go through official channels. They used to remittances used to happen through banking. People would send money and invest in or put their money in the banks or whatnot. How people lived up. Now that's not happening anymore, but it's going through basically direct channels to the people, the beneficiaries. So it's bypassing the banking system, and it's going directly to the benefit of people. So yes, of the intended recipients. So in a way, that's continued, and it's more effective right now, and it costs less for
That's a good
costs the
point.
diaspora less to maintain their relatives in the country. So that's one thing, and of course, like you said, I mean, it's Beirut is the one that's feeling the collapse the most because it had the most, because
Yeah.
it's a very centralized economy where all basically the money in the banking and whatnot is here in the city. So other parts of the country where the economy, their local economy, is not based on banking and real estate and the Ponzi scheme, they have it's less affected. I'm not saying it's not affected because I mean the currency has lost a lot of its value and whatnot, and obviously there are also the fuel shortages that are centralized, but it's they just have always been kind of detached from the central economy. That so yeah, they are affected less. Whether it's Zahle, which has it has its own power structure, the electricity structure that's separate from the Lebanese electric company, and it used to provide and still provides more electricity than it used to be 24 hours electricity, one of the only spots in Lebanon, or few
Yeah.
spots. There are some municipalities that also have this, they run their own power grid, but the only major city that did have that in Lebanon. Now it's no longer 24 hours. There's some rationing, but nowhere near the rationing that we're seeing in the rest of Lebanon. So yes, it is. You go there, and it's actually pleasant. It's not here. The people are not. I mean, the people are less angry. The people are. I mean, also they have the best ada in the world, so that makes them.
That helps. I didn't know that actually. For those who are going to visit Lebanon, there you go.
They're known for their gastronomy and beverages.
Yeah, they have really nice vineyards. Yeah, their vineyards are excellent. I visited the Zahle vineyards before. But I wanted to ask you as well, you know, you alluded to this, but actually you specifically said this, but how much worse can it get?
Violence, eruption of violence everywhere. More. I mean, obviously we've had a lot more robberies, but violent crime has not. I mean, it's also going to increase. But I'm talking more about militant violence, militias. Incidents like what happened last couple of days in Khalde, south of Lebanon, south of Beirut. Incidents at gas stations, random clashes between factions. I know there were clashes a few years back in Tripoli. You mentioned Tripoli. They had sectarian clashes up there. Maybe these could re-erupt and other incidents like that. But yeah, no, there's always the possibility of complete chaos and collapse if we continue. I mean, how long can this be sustained? So this is, I mean, there seems to be indicators that there will be at least keep the country afloat until the next election. There seems to be the Western direction that they're taking, that they want to basically form a new government that would carry the country until the May elections next year, and hope to change the balance of powers in parliament through these elections. So that might be a bit of a respite, but it's not going to be like there are no solutions being discussed, like permanent solutions, or still, like, even though we're in the middle of collapse, there's just we're
Yeah,
waiting it out. And there's like you mentioned, there was a caretaker government that even when it came to power, it was torpedoed immediately from within. It had a plan that was proposed to basically a recovery plan, and it was torpedoed by forces that formed the government. Basically the banker allies in the government torpedoed the plan, and this included mainly the Speaker of the House and his party, Nabih Berri and his party, and part of the FPM, and through some of his MPs, that actually basically shut down the plan by the government that they're supposed to be part of. So and we've been at stalemate. We've been basically just waiting it out with all the power and all the sitting in the hands of the head of the central bank, who's basically deciding to print money when he wants to and collecting dollars when he needs to from the market, and basically levying tax on everybody by reducing the value of the national currency. This is and then reducing purchasing power of people, and that's all being done by one person, who
Riad Salameh.
Riad Salameh, who answers to no one but the State Department.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Are you talking about the head of the central bank, Riad Salameh?
I'm saying the head of the central bank is a U.S. asset that's been planted to help.
He did. That's what he did through the banking system. He basically ensured that Hezbollah specifically could not be a part of the banking system. He helped even dissolve Jamal Trust, which they called a Hezbollah bank a few years ago before the economic collapse, on behalf of the Americans, on behalf of the Trump administration, because it was a Shia-owned bank, and the Trump administration was just extremely hostile to anything Shia, whether it was connected to Hezbollah or not. But yeah, this guy is really, standing in the way, or he is responsible for the country's collapse more than anyone else. And what I thought was interesting was during those 2019 protests, and you and I were there together, we would go to these to observe these protests outside of the central bank, and it was always mostly Hezbollah people that were protesting the head of the central bank as like the top figure we should be targeting. And it was surprising to see that he wasn't the central figure that the leftists were going after. But it was like Hezbollah activists that was just an interesting dynamic. It's like, where's the left? But anyways, that's besides the point. There's a couple more things I want to ask you, one of which is about the currency. The currency's constantly devaluing and then going up and down, going up and down. It seems to be like a group of people and their emotions that day that decide. How do you explain this change in the value of the currency on a daily basis? Like, who's doing this? Who's deciding this? I don't know if anybody really knows the answer. But
no, obviously the devaluation of the currency happened mainly because the central bank was printing liras and not interfering to defend its value, because this is the job of the central bank. You can use your foreign reserves. His excuse is that he doesn't have enough foreign reserves to interfere in the market and protect the lira, the Lebanese pound. But that's based on his words, because he refuses to basically reveal or let anyone have access to the actual number. This is as we're talking. Someone has so much power and he has the only access to the information, and he's you have to take his word for it, even though he's been proven to be a Ponzi schemer. No, he's a Ponzi schemer. He's a Bernie Madoff. And he just refuses to, and you cannot touch him because he's protected by
the Americans.
mainly, and major
bankers.
oligarchs here, and Maronite patriarch, which is also an oligarch. I mean, the institution is the biggest owner of real estate in the country,
I
and
did not know
and oh
that.
yeah, they. And obviously, they have a lot of interest in the banks and a lot of money in the banks and a lot of pull in that sense.
I wonder if they have electricity.
Actually, the summer, what do you call it, headquarters of the Maronite patriarchy is in a very nice mountain town that you probably can sleep with the windows open. The weather's nice. You don't need.
Oh, you don't need AC.
You know.
So So I guess the last thing I would want to ask you is, our audience is obviously mostly American, of a leftist bent. So what would you want Americans to understand about what's happening in Lebanon? What's like the last thing you want to leave them with? Yeah.
What do I want Americans to understand?
Or do you want them to understand it? Do you care what Americans think about Lebanon? I don't know.
I mean, I care what the Americans are doing in Lebanon. Obviously, most of your audience knows that the U.S. foreign policy tends to be very destructive in many of the countries in all of the countries of the global South, and even in policies towards their allies in the global North. But I mean, there's really not much to know except that this is a fault line in the fight between or against the state of Israel, which was created and continues to serve as a satellite colonial state to serve the interests of the West and to divide the region. And this is, again, it will never, this region will never prosper and truly rise until that war is over and with the liberation of Palestine. So this is the main issue here. It will always be the main issue, and until that happens, we'll always be facing imperialist intervention by the U.S.
And then lastly, before we lose electricity, which is coming soon, where can people follow your work?
On Twitter and Akhbar, if you read Arabic, and Twitter, Jamal Ghosn. I don't know if my name will come up on the screen.
I'll link to it.
That's very much it.
I'll link to it. Jamal, thank you so much. Columnist for Akhbar. We really appreciate you joining us and breaking everything down.
Thank you, Rania.